sections, but other than that, like their beliefs are very similar to
The Protestant?
They're actually very similar to the Catholic Church.
Oh.
So that's the big difference is they don't believe there should be one
Head
human
guy.
telling them what to do.
Yeah. They do have a head bishop who's referred to as a patriarch.
Yeah.
But as many Orthodox churches as there are, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, there are that many patriarchs. Yeah, so it's an organizational structure. There's a difference.
Yeah, they kind of like, even though there is that head bishop, he still like discusses decisions with the other bishops.
Right.
It's not one person making all
Right.
the decisions.
It's like, I think the Orthodox term is like the first among equals, or something like that. Yeah. Oh, there are a host of other differences that if only we had time to get into.
I mean, I think
But
that was.
when you take Core 102, you will visit an Orthodox church in St. Louis and talk about some of those uniquenesses. Yeah. Well, one of the most visible differences, and this is a result of the iconoclastic controversy that you read about way back. What was that? 2 weeks ago. So it's already fading into the deep recesses of your memory, if it's not gone entirely. The discussion among Christians about whether or not it's okay to use paintings, images, statues, things like that. And where the Orthodox Church settled out on that issue was paintings. So anytime you see those stylized paintings of saints, of Mary and Jesus and things like that, that's Orthodox. The Catholic Church uses paintings, but also uses images, statues, representation.
What about the Sistine Chapel? Would that be Orthodox?
No, that's Catholic. That was commissioned by one of the popes in Rome. Yeah. So yeah, but that's more realistic.
Yeah.
Well, because it's painted by Michelangelo, one of the foremost painters of his era. Yeah. No, so it's not that the Catholic Church only uses statues; they also use painting. But the Orthodox Church only uses painting, no statues. Yeah. No, and that's what prompted my comment when this topic came up. For those of you who are Protestants, you might wonder if the use of statues in churches violates the commandment about graven images. And some Protestants have thought that over time. But the reason it doesn't is because Catholics are much better at discerning the difference between worship and veneration. Veneration to show respect to something. Worship, that's reserved for the divine, right? For God. Veneration, showing respect for, well, people who have lived exemplary lives. Somebody had a question or comment?
I was going to say that like once you go on the board in the future, you'll definitely see the difference because in the Catholic Church, there will be like you said, like the more realistic and humanistic versus the Orthodox. It's more like not cartoonish, but that's how I would explain it.
Yeah, the term that I've seen is style. It follows a certain set style, and it doesn't vary from that style. And it's,
Like you look at it and like,
if you haven't grown up around it, yeah. For people who've grown up around it, it's quite natural. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the Dark Ages. What do you suppose historians call the period between the Dark Ages and the era that came next? The what?
Middle Ages.
Yeah, of course. Creative, right? The Middle Ages. The Middle Ages. We'll talk later about what comes next. Well, in fact, in this section, we'll talk about what comes next. Now, the period from last week's that was really only the quiz, the reading and the quiz, the transformation of Europe. Okay, something happens right around this point here that makes Europe poised for the first time to exert its influence, geographically speaking, outside the geographic area of Europe. Up until this point, for this whole period of 1,000 years, Europe is besieged. Okay, the Vikings from the north, the Moors from the south, they occupied parts of Spain, and the Slavs and other nomadic horse riding tribes from the east. except for the brief period of the Crusades, Europe is beset by enemies on all sides. Now, for the first time, 1500s marks a turning point, and for the first time, Europe becomes poised to begin exerting its influence on areas outside of Europe. Well, that's what leads to the discovery of the New World. And there's a series of new inventions, navigational instruments, a series of new technologies, applying gunpowder to weapons, rifles and cannons, things like that, that allow Europe to have an advantage over everybody that they would meet. Well, primarily the Native Americans in the New World, but also the Muslims and other forces that they would fight against. And so, really, last week, this week, and next week, okay, the transformation and expansion of Europe, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment we're pausing on the next 3 centuries: the 1500s, the 1600s, and the 1700s. Okay, here we are in 2 weeks. We leapfrogged over 1,000 years of history, and now in these 3 weeks, last week, this week, and next week, we're going to pause in this tumultuous 15 to 1600 era right here. Beginning last week with the transformation and expansion of Europe, extending this week to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is just one of those French words that crept into our vocabulary, like so many other French words have, meaning a rebirth. And it's referring to, the lights going off here, only being dimly lit here, to all of a sudden burning brightly and increasing in brilliance in the Renaissance. A rebirth, well, in many senses, a rebirth of culture, a rebirth of learning, a rebirth in the sciences and the arts, and a rebirth in many areas. Let's take a look at some of those areas. The Renaissance outlook. No? Yes?
There it is.
The Renaissance outlook. Medieval institutions, okay, feudalism, the church being the primary institution in society, and the outlook that's associated with that. Medieval institutions begin giving way to modern forms. So what we're seeing is the birth pangs of what would come to be called this era after the Middle Ages, called the modern era. So we're witnessing the birth pangs of the modern era. So let's compare and contrast what came before with what comes later. First of all, economic forms change. Okay, from feudalism, it's where there's the lord of the manor, everybody else is serfs who work for him, or like ladies in waiting, knights in waiting, squires, who, when the need arises, provide military service for the feudal lord. Okay, so from feudalism, the economic transformation that comes next is called capitalism. During this period, the beginnings of capitalism start to be seen. In the political realm, what changes in the political realm? The political changes from absolutism, that is one person, one rule, okay, a king or a queen. Absolute one person ruler with absolute power, absolute authority. The political form that succeeds that comes after that, is democracy. Not nearly yet, right? Okay, because it's not even the United States. That's the first place it comes to full fruition. The United States, 1776. That's going to be a couple of centuries yet. But so we're talking about from the Middle Ages to the modern era. What changes? And in the economic area, that changes. In the political area, it changes from absolutism to democracy. In the religious area, it changes from hierarchical, a bishop, a pope with all the power, that's transmitted through archbishops and bishops and the priestly class, to egalitarian, that is, people being equal. And next week we'll talk about the Reformation. Okay, so next week our focus will be on what happened in the religious realm that reflect this change from medieval to modern institutions. And we see the birth of the Protestant movement. In social classes, in the social arena, the transition is from the upper class having all the privileges to the upper class losing those privileges and becoming equal to everybody else. The American Revolution and the French Revolution are key events that bring that change about. Before that, it's, well, the upper class, right? The elites, the aristocracy have special privileges. They're not tried in the same courts. If an aristocrat kills somebody who's not an aristocrat, they're not going to be charged in those courts. They have their own special courts, of course, or they're going to be more leniently treated, right? Probably not found guilty. So the aristocratic classes have special privileges that nobody else in society enjoys. And one of the reasons why the French Revolution was such a violent affair was because the lower classes resented all the privileges by the upper class and sent a lot of them, when they gained power, sent a lot of them to the guillotine. But we'll talk about that with the French Revolution. And because all this other change is going on, it can't help but also have impact in culture. And so wide sweeping changes come to, well, to art and to music. And it's the birth of what comes to be called, right, the classical era in music, right? It's where symphonies and operas and things like that begin to be written. Most of that stuff doesn't get written during the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages kind of lays groundwork for this musical revolution that would also happen, and in art and in other areas. What are the backgrounds? Well, the background is that society is changing. Right? They're beginning to become aware of people outside of Europe. It starts with the Crusades, but it expands greatly with the discoveries of North and South America. And with these technological transformations, then other transformations start happening in society. What can we say about a Renaissance worldview? Well, it's a worldview that changes quite radically from what came before, the worldview of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance worldview has respect for classical examples. And these are examples going all the way back to, 500 BC. These are Greek and Roman. Okay, so the term classical there refers to Greek and Roman. So the scholars of this time period, the 15, 16, 1700s, try as by any means possible to get their hands on stuff that the Greeks and the Romans wrote. That we're going back, let's say this is going back 1,000, 1,500 years, right? Much of which had been lost in European universities, but was preserved by Muslim scholars. And so the Crusades and things like that, and the contact between Spaniards and Muslims in Spain, when Muslims had control of Spain, helped recover some of those lost classics from the Greek and Roman scholars through Muslim influence. So a great respect for classical examples, reading the Greek poets and philosophers, the Roman poets and philosophers. It's also the beginning of what we see now coming to full fruition in our culture, a worldview focused on individualism. That is, it's the person, the individual, with their personal rights. Not so much responsibilities, more on rights, right? Personal rights, individual rights. The individual as the basic unit of society, from everything else it builds from there. A focus on individualism, well, what's the opposite of individualism? Collectivism or corporatism, okay, where the group matters more than the individual. That's the opposite in our culture, right? That tends to be a little bit more the case in Europe, in Canada, where they're not as afraid of socialism as we are in the United States. But because the United States individualism is such a high priority, we tend to be a little bit more nervous about aspects of socialism that Europeans are more willing to embrace. And perhaps the most important or the hallmark idea of the Renaissance is humanism. Any view that puts the human person at the center of things and stresses the individual's creative reasoning and aesthetic powers. Humanism. In a lot of Christian circles, this has become a dirty word. Humanistic. There are strengths and weaknesses. From a Christian's perspective, there are strengths and weaknesses. Not necessarily anti-Christian, because Christian humanism stresses a pure form of Christianity based on direct study of the Bible. And during the Reformation, we'll talk about a Christian humanist by the name of Erasmus, who shows how it's possible to be thoroughly Christian, but also embrace some, not all, but some of the aspects of humanism in order to make Christianity better, in order to make it more like the New Testament. Okay. All right, let's compare and contrast medieval and Renaissance worldview. By looking at medieval values, okay, the values of Europe during the Middle Ages, and contrasting those with the values, the outlook, the worldview of the Renaissance, what comes later. Medieval values are God-centered. Renaissance values are man-centered, humankind-centered. There are strengths and weaknesses to both. We'll talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of both. Asceticism. An ascetic. Somebody who goes without worldly pleasures in order to be more devoted to something else. The typical, in Christian circles, typical ascetics are monks and nuns. They take vows of poverty, vows of chastity. They live in community under a certain rule, the Benedictine rule, the Franciscan rule, and they submit to the authority of the head of the monastery or the head of the convent. Ascetics, somebody who's willing to go without, to live a simpler lifestyle, in order to be more devoted to something else, more devoted to the following God, in the case of monks and nuns. Yeah, what's interesting is, I've just begun hearing, maybe you guys have heard also about a new monastic movement. No, a new monastic movement in Protestant circles. A Protestant monastic movement. Shane Claiborne, is he one of the leaders of a new monasticism? It's a Protestant monasticism. Yeah, typically monks are either Catholic or Orthodox. When the Protestant Reformation happened, it's kind of like Protestants did away with vows of poverty and chastity and being monks and nuns. But now there's a movement afoot in Protestant circles to try to recover kind of some of this lost sense of what happens when you become an ascetic. And you devote yourself, you say no to certain things in order to say yes more fully to other things having to do with God. Medieval values tend to be otherworldly. Focus on the spiritual, on the heavenly, and things like that. Whereas Renaissance values tend to focus more on the here and now. Medieval values tended towards the superstitious. Renaissance values tended towards rationalism. What can be reasoned? Let me give you one of my favorite examples of the superstitiousness of medieval values. There was this thing called relics, this tradition in medieval Christianity called relics. Anything, any object, anything that had been associated with a person who lived an especially, a life especially devoted to God. Even more so if it had to do with one of the 12 apostles. Even more so if it had to do with Mary or Jesus. I'm talking about objects, okay, relics. Relics, you think of relics as, like from a shipwreck or something like that, an object from a shipwreck, a relic. Well, these are relics associated with Christians who lived especially devoted lives, going all the way back to Mary and Jesus and the 12 apostles. A piece of cloth from the swaddling clothes in which Jesus was wrapped when he was saved, a relic with special powers. A tooth said to have belonged to St. Peter. An object of special powers, right? The knuckle bone from the skeleton of Paul. Ooh. Special power. Extra special power, right? I've got one even better. a splinter from the cross. Imagine having in your possession a splinter from the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified. I don't mean as an object of historical significance. I mean as an object possessing, because of what it was, possessing special supernatural powers. And medieval Christianity was full of these things, relics. There was a very active trade in relics, buyers and sellers of relics. People who would have traveled to the Middle East and found some of this stuff and put it in gold boxes, jeweled cases, and sold it for high prices to wealthy lords of the manor. And people prided themselves on their collections of relics. Tradition, because these were believed to have had special power, it became traditional for knights, when they had their special sword made, to have a relic embedded in the hilt of their sword, to give them special power in battle. It kind of began to fall out of favor, particularly after the Reformation and more emphasis on rationalism over superstition, which of course is what it was, right? Superstition, Christian superstition. If you've studied anything about Native American culture, you know, for example, that the shamans had these pouches with special herbs and things like that inside that gave them special powers. It's kind of in that same category. Ascribing special supernatural powers to objects that may or may not have been actually what they were. I mean, there's probably enough splinters of the cross spread across Europe to have made 100 crosses. Is what it turned out to be. All right. And then the last medieval value, religion as the center of life versus religion, the perception that religion was just another human creation. Oh, there's more. All right. Here's the rest. Poverty. It doesn't mean that all medieval people were poor, but it means that poverty was valued. I mean, as a special calling in life. So that's why monks and nuns would take vows of poverty. That's why special exemplary Christians like Francis of Assisi, okay, the son of a wealthy Italian merchant, would give up his inheritance and devote himself instead to, well, he founded the Franciscans, which became known as the mendicant order. Mendicant meaning begging. Okay? They would renounce worldly possessions and just live according to what people would give them and go around from village to village preaching the gospel. So while this was held as a high value, Francis of Assisi was looked up to by the medieval values. He was from the 1200s. It's the heroes of the Middle Ages were people who took vows of poverty like this. So Francis of Assisi, LeBron James, the Middle Ages. Yeah. Poverty as opposed to materialism, humility as opposed to pride and human achievement. Comparing and contrasting medieval and Renaissance values. All right. So humanism, which I think in Christian circles has gotten a bad rap, in some reasons deservedly so, is not all bad as it turns out. And there are some aspects of humanism that actually help Christianity become better. Well, by better I mean return it to a more of a New Testament form of Christianity. One of my personal favorites is this guy named Erasmus of Rotterdam, who exemplifies this. Jordan.
I would just say my own why
Well, there were a lot of humanists. Well, no, not necessarily before him. Just a lot of humanists. Well, before, during, and after, who made no attempts to be Christian, and in fact tried as much as possible to distance themselves from Christianity, because they looked at the negative influences and impacts that Christianity was having in the Middle Ages. And there's a lot to be criticized about the Church of the Middle Ages. and said, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I'm going in this direction, humanism. But Erasmus comes along and he says, wait, let's not throw everything away. There's some elements of medieval Christianity that are good. There's some that can be criticized, but there are some that are good. Let's not be totally skeptical of humanism. Yes, it undervalues Christianity, but there are things there that are useful to help us make Christianity more like New Testament Christianity. So he wasn't the first humanist, but he was the first Christian humanist. And an important figure in helping to bridge the gap between humanism and Christianity. He was interested in classics. Okay, humanists liked the writings of the Greeks and the Romans. He was interested in the classics, but for the purpose of studying ancient languages, Greek and Hebrew in particular, to discover a more accurate biblical text, which helped contribute to the biblical awakening. A resurging interest in the Bible itself. Here's one of the reasons why this was an issue in the 1500s. The church had its authorized version of the Bible called the Vulgate. It was translated by Jerome in, I forget when Jerome lived, 400s, 500s, 600s, somewhere in there. So Jerome translates the Vulgate into Latin. And the church says, here's the authorized version of the Bible. Any other versions are not authorized. In fact, can't be used, are condemned. And Erasmus comes along and he studies Greek and he studies Hebrew and he says, wait a minute, I think the Vulgate would be more accurate if we translated it this way. And the church says, no, there's no budging on this issue. The Vulgate is the only authorized version. In spite of the fact that other scholars who were studying Greek and Hebrew and reading the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, reading the Greek version of the New Testament, were saying there's better ways, we can come up with a better translation, a more accurate translation. And that became an issue over which people lost their lives in the Middle Ages by trying to come up with a new translation. What's more, and this is a topic we'll come to next week with the Reformation, is an interest in making the Bible available in the languages of the people. And the church at that time said, which is all of our church, right? It's not until 1517 that the break would come and the Protestant Reformation would start. So if we're talking about before 1500s, we're talking about our church. The church is our church. Protestants and okay, not Orthodox. They had their own church by then, but Protestants and Catholics, where there was no difference before 1517. Okay, so some Christians started saying, a lot of people don't read Latin. What's more is, if it's read to them in Latin, they don't understand Latin. They speak German, they speak Italian, they speak French, Spanish, and English. How about if we translate the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into English, into German, into Spanish? And the church was immovable on that subject. No, the Vulgate in Latin, the only authorized version of it. In fact, so much so that people who tried to make these translations were viewed as heretics and were burned at the stake. John Wycliffe, in the 1300s in England, comes up with a new English translation of the Bible. But gets persecuted for it and ultimately loses his life. One of the reasons why now the largest Protestant missionary organization in the world, which specializes in translating the Bible into tribal languages, is called Wycliffe Bible Translators. They take their name from John Wycliffe, an early reformer who tried to promote the translating the Bible into English. So Erasmus was all about studying Greek and Hebrew in order to better understand the Bible. Exalted human capabilities. We celebrate life while anticipating heaven. Middle Ages, Erasmus would have said the Middle Ages were too interested in anticipating heaven so that they were no earthly good, not doing any good here on earth. Erasmus said that we have, as humans, we have the capacity for reason, for being rational, and that's a God-given capacity. We should not be afraid of it. We should use it for the purpose of glorifying God. And he was willing to criticize conventional, that is, medieval Christianity. Some elements of medieval Christianity he was willing to criticize. in order to promote a purer faith, apostolic meaning more like the New Testament, more like the first century. And unlike other reformers, Erasmus was committed to trying to keep the church unified, trying to keep it together. And so he criticized the church, but it was a criticism from within. He still respected the church for it. Unlike some other reformers that we'll talk about next week. The spread of the Renaissance. The Gutenberg printing press. 1400s. It's what? Hans
Gutenberg.
Gutenberg.
Mm-hmm.
He was German, definitely. A German goldsmith that invents movable type, and so printing. You know, before printing, the printing press, everything was, the only thing was handwriting. And so it would take an entire year to make a copy of the Bible. One month sitting there, here's the original, copying it over here. One full year working every day, all day, every day. After the invention of the printing press, you could print the new Bible in one day. So it was the technological revolution that made possible a lot of the changes going on in Europe at this time.
So, but would they? I have a question about that.
Yes.
Would they still have to make a translation by hand and then print what they wrote? You know what I mean?
Translation?
Yeah.
About
Like with the printing press.
Translated Bible?
Yeah. Would they still have to have a handwritten copy and then make copies of it with the printing press?
Probably so, because they'd have to know what order to put the
Exactly.
letters in.
That's what. Yeah.
Yeah. Because the technician would know how to operate the printing press, but wouldn't necessarily know what the Bible says without
Yeah.
having to be able to read the handbook version.
Okay. That's.
Yeah. Yeah. Strengthen lay piety, lay non-priestly, okay, non-ordained lay piety, the average person in the pews. The use of Renaissance tools to restore it to its apostolic purity. Yeah, that was one of Erasmus's goals. Outside of Italy, less concerned with the revival of classical culture than with the reform of Christianity. So Italy, because in Italy, you know, that's where so much of the Roman culture had thrived, you know, going back 1,000 years ago. Italians were more interested in reviving Roman culture. Outside of Italy, they were more interested in reforming the church. So the Reformation doesn't start in Italy, it starts where? Yeah, no, you haven't read that chapter yet. I'm appealing to information from outside from your previous catechism or something like that.
Germany.
Germany, the Reformation starts in Germany, Martin Luther. Yeah, okay.
Is Martin Luther
Study
German?
classical writing, language, and arrive at a more reliable translation of biblical text. And because we still have 2 minutes of class left, the Renaissance set cultural standards for the modern age. All you have to do is look at the paintings of Michelangelo and the other ninja turtles. What were their names? Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. Yeah, those 4 guys who from the 15, 16, and 1700s, their paintings set standards that well, until modern art movement, that art still tried to.
I always like talking about it.
All right. I can't put the chicken nugget for calling your name.
No, that's only preview day. That would be next Monday.
Okay. But yeah, I